This hearing will come to order. This morning we consider options available to the new administration as it contends with an emboldened Iran. As one witness will tell the committee, we should start from this premise. Iran gets no special pass on its dangerous and provocative acts. Unfortunately, despite its promises to the committee, that's not how the previous administration handled Tehran. Terrorism and missile activities that should have been designated were not designated. In a country where beatings and torture and executions are the norm, just one individual has been sanctioned for human rights abuses after negotiations began. Just one. After that deal was inked, the former Secretary of State traveled the world enthusiastically touting that Iran was open for business. Indeed, the administration went out of its way not to offend Tehran, and in December, when this committee pressed the extension of the Iran Sanctions Act, the President took the very unusual step of letting this legislation become law without his signature. So it's not surprising that Tehran believes it's in a post-sanctions environment, but as long as Iran is firing missiles and fueling terror and shouting death to America, nothing can be normal. Sanctions can be imposed, even while adhering to and strictly enforcing the nuclear agreement, as flawed as it is. Remember, even under the previous administration's reading, the administration has the ability to press back on Iran's support for terrorism, for human rights abuses, and for missile development. None of these sanctions were relieved under the agreement, in terms of the words of the former administration. So, Iran's continuing intercontinental ballistic missile program, whose only purpose is to carry a nuclear warhead, must be front and center. This month's designations are a good start, but more can be done to find and target the banks and companies that are supplying this dangerous program aimed at us. It also means more extraditions, more prosecutions, and indictments of sanctions violators. This proactive approach also means stepping up our defenses and those of our regional partners. Second, the administration shouldn't be shy about tackling Iran's terror arm, and that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is the group fueling the Assad regime in Syria, and this is the group responsible for the death of hundreds of American troops. Since the Guard has been labeled Iran's most powerful economic actor by the U.S. Treasury Department, there are plenty of options here available. Indeed, there are hundreds of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps affiliates that are yet to be sanctioned, what one observer calls a Revolutionary Guard's gap. And these are the front companies that are funding the missiles that have on the side of them, Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. These terror outfits need to be sanctioned, and the new administration should look at ways in which companies closely linked to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but not fully owned by them, could be sanctioned. The threat of secondary sanctions against those around the world dealing with these groups, these IRGC units, which even tried to carry out a terrorist attack here in Washington, D.C., to kill the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. Looking at this must be a priority. And it's got to be real, and it wasn't under the previous administration. Around the region, the administration can attack Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, thanks to a new law advanced by this committee. We can focus on increased interdiction of Iranian arms shipments to the revolutionary Houthis in Yemen, clear rules of engagement, and better defense cooperation with our partners on the front lines of the Iranian threat. The nuclear agreement does not leave us defenseless against Tehran's threatening behavior. Careful coordination with allies is a must, and all along we should be clear that the choice is with Iran to end its threatening, destabilizing behavior. I'm going to introduce our panel this morning, and then I'm going to go to Mr. Elliot Engel of New York, who is the ranking member of this committee. On our panel, we have Ms. Catherine Bauer. She is the Blumenstein-Katz Family Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and previously she served in a series of positions at the Treasury Department. We have Mr. David Albright, and he is the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security, and Mr. Albright is a trained physicist and former weapons inspector. We have Mr. Scott Modell, managing director at the Rapidan Group, and previously he served for 13 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. And we have Dr. Andrew Exum, contributing editor at The Atlantic, and previously Dr. Exum served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record, and you'll be asked to summarize if you could. The members here are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or additional questions, any extraneous material they might want to put into the record. So we would start with Mr. Bauer, and but before we do that, allow me to have the ranking member of the committee, Elliot Engel, open with his opening comments.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me also thank our witnesses and welcome all of you to the Foreign Affairs Committee. At this point, we all know Iran's record of provocative actions, from ballistic missile tests to transferring weapons to terrorist organizations and other bad actors that seek to destabilize the region. Technically speaking, all this bad behavior doesn't violate the nuclear deal. However, those actions are inconsistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which governs the implementation of the agreement. Responsible governments around the world have an obligation to respond. The Trump administration imposed new sanctions against several entities involved in Iran's ballistic missile program and support for terrorism. And just to make sure we're all being fair, I'll mention that these designations matched exactly the Obama administration's response over the last several years since negotiations began. The difference between the Trump administration's response and the Obama administration's response was a 2-word phrase, on notice. Then National Security Advisor Mike Flynn said that as a result of Iran's provocative actions, the United States is putting Iran on notice. So what does it mean exactly to put Iran on notice? How will the administration respond if Iran tests the president again? Does the administration have a plan? In a follow-up briefing to the on-notice warning, a reporter asked what that meant. The response was, we are considering what options there are and how we want to communicate and enforce our concerns. That's not really a plan. I hope that the administration will make it clear what their plan is on Iran, because surely Iran will continue its provocative behavior. We cannot afford a half-baked or reckless foreign policy. Rash decisions concerning America's role in the world could have serious consequences for American personnel and interests. American and Iranian forces are operating in close proximity in Iraq. Who knows what could happen if the administration doesn't have a cohesive policy. Additionally, if this turns out to be an empty threat, then this administration will not have done its job. We have to really confront the Iranian threat and let them know that we're serious about it, that we mean business. I don't trust the Iranian government. I didn't vote for the Iranian deal. But the Iranian deal is now in place, and I think we have to ensure that Iran lives up to every bit of its responsibility under that deal. Let me just say this. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what a responsible course of action would be. Iran and the terrible regime in Tehran is not going away, and I think that if the United States doesn't stand up to it, it'll only get worse. I believe with all my heart that everything must be done to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. However, looking the other way and just tough rhetoric doesn't really cut the mustard. We've got to make sure that Iran understands that there are severe consequences if they continue their ways. And I look forward to to hearing from our witnesses as to what they think our response should be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Engel, we now go to our witnesses. Ms. Bauer.
Good morning. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today to discuss the future of U.S. policy towards Iran. My testimony will focus on the role of sanctions in restraining Iran's malign influence in the region and disrupting its global terrorism, money laundering, and procurement networks. It will draw an analysis done in conjunction with my colleagues Patrick Clausen and Matthew Levitt at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy as part of a new study that we released earlier this week. I will summarize key points here. There is no doubt today that sanctions played a pivotal role in bringing Iran to the table to negotiate constraints on its nuclear program. Over roughly a decade, the U.S. and its allies imposed powerful multilateral sanctions on Iran that isolated Tehran from the international financial system and crippled its economy. Following implementation of the Iran nuclear deal in January 2016 and suspension of nuclear-related sanctions, the pace of sanctions against Iran under remaining authorities slowed. Despite assurances that the United States would vigorously press against Iranian activities outside of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Obama administration did so only sporadically. Thus, in many ways, Washington ceded the narrative to Tehran, which successfully convinced many in the private and public sectors that in the wake of implementation of the nuclear agreement, they operate in a post-sanctions environment. But the deal was never intended to give Iran a free pass on its non-nuclear malevolent actions. Iran made no commitment to cease non-nuclear malign activity and has not, in fact, halted it. In the words of Abbas Araghchi, Iran's deputy foreign minister and one of Iran's chief negotiators of the deal, quote, "During the nuclear negotiations, we clearly said that questions of security, defense, ballistic missiles, and our regional policies were not negotiable and not linked to the nuclear talks." Sanctions remain a viable and powerful tool to confront Iran over its non-nuclear illicit conduct. In our study, we suggest a multi-pronged approach that includes taking back the narrative, emphasizing the sanctions that remain, and vigorously enforcing them. Such enhanced sanctions will work best, however, if they are proportional and accompanied by diplomatic, military, and intelligence measures in a coordinated campaign against Iran's destabilizing activities. Sanctions are a tool in such a strategy, but not a strategy unto themselves. There is a place for unilateral sanctions, such as the action taken by the Trump administration late last month against Iranian procurement and terrorist support networks. These actions were likely prepared under the Obama administration, and as Congressman Engel noted, they demonstrate a bipartisan consensus on targeting Iran's malign activities. They are also effective because banks around the world look to the U.S. and to the OFAC list, and they can be very disruptive. As well, they lay the groundwork for other countries to follow suit. However, sanctions are most effective when adopted by an international coalition. Foreign partners have long been skeptical of U.S. unilateral sanctions when they are viewed as being capricious. Thus, focusing on Iranian conduct that violates international norms will be most likely to draw multilateral support and compliance. In this manner, sanctions can also demonstrate to Iran the benefits of accommodating itself to the international order. Consider the benefits that Iran has gleaned from the nuclear deal. Oil sales and other exports are up, and inflation has stabilized. Iranian officials claim that hundreds of small banks have already reestablished correspondent relationships with Iran. But Iran will not be able to attract the foreign investment it desperately needs, while global banks continue to view it as a financial pariah. And there is no reason to believe that Iran has ceased the illicit financial conduct or sanctions evasion conduct that underpinned the U.S. FinCEN 311 finding of Iran as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern, or earned Iran its place on the Financial Action Task Force blacklist. Previously, private sector engagement on the risks of doing business with Iran proved incredibly effective as a tool to restrict Iran's operating environment. Given this history, the U.S. government should resume such sanctions diplomacy and engagements with private and public sector actors around the world to highlight evidence that Iran continues to pose a threat to the global financial system. Rather than reassuring banks that doing business with Iran will help enshrine the nuclear deal, U.S. government officials at every level should emphasize that Iran bears the onus of demonstrating its adherence to the same requirements imposed on every other country. By reining in illicit financial activity, and conforming with international norms. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Ready?
Feel free, Mr. Albright,
Okay.
please.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and other members of this committee for holding this hearing today and inviting me to testify. I applaud your committee's efforts to understand and chart a way forward on Iran policy. I would like to limit my comments to the Iran nuclear deal, which I would like to see maintained. But the deal must be better enforced and implemented, its nuclear conditions more strictly interpreted, its verification improved, and its short and long-term deficiencies fixed. I listed in my testimony several steps to fix the weaknesses in the deal, and will briefly discuss some of them here. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the specific problems in the deal's implementation. As the Chairman mentioned, Iran continues to test nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. We can argue whether this is inconsistent with or in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. However, the fact of the matter is that a nuclear warhead without a reliable delivery system is not a militarily useful nuclear weapon. So progress on ballistic missiles today and tomorrow represents progress toward Iran building a nuclear weapons arsenal in the future. The workings of the deal have been far too secret. Moreover, the IAEA continues to underreport the actual situation on the ground. Many of the Joint Commission decisions are questionable, and I've given several examples in my testimony. Also, so far, Iran has resisted IAEA inspections of military sites, and the risk is growing that Iran is creating no-go zones for inspectors inside Iran. Moreover, during the JCPOA negotiations and extending for some time afterwards, the Obama administration interfered in U.S. law enforcement efforts. It blocked or did not process extradition requests and lure memos aimed at Iranians and their agents alleged of violating U.S. trade control and sanction laws. I'd like to briefly discuss some specific steps to ensure stricter enforcement and strengthening of the JCPOA in the short term, and I give many in my testimony. There is a need to achieve greater transparency in IAEA access. The U.S. and its allies should press the IAEA to include greater details in its quarterly reports to the Board of Governors. Parallel agreements to the JCPOA should be publicly released. More importantly, it is critical to ensure that Iran provides guaranteed, timely IAEA access to Iranian military facilities. It is also a priority to prevent Iran developing an indigenous enriched uranium fuel capability. If they do so, this would lay the basis for an expanded industrial-scale centrifuge program that would be very difficult to stop. Toward that goal, further exemptions to the 300-kilogram enriched uranium cap should be deferred indefinitely. There are also numerous loopholes to the JCPOA that need to be fixed. I will mention two here. The Oman loophole for heavy water should be plugged. To that end, all shipments of Iranian heavy water from Oman or other overseas storage locations should be subject to approval by the Procurement Working Group. It is also important to ensure that Iran is abiding by restrictions on centrifuge R&D under the JCPOA. There's examples where they're pushing the envelope, and the pushback needs to happen. It's also critical that Iran create and implement a strategic trade control system that meets international standards. As part of creating a strategic trade control regime in Iran, the United States should also interpret the JCPOA as stating that Iran will commit not to conduct illicit commodity trafficking for government-controlled or owned military, missile, nuclear, or other industries and programs. As we await that, there needs to be more effective enforcement of trading bans and sanctions. The administration should commit to more aggressively investigate, indict, and extradite those involved in outfitting Iran's nuclear, missile, or conventional weapons programs in defiance of U.S. laws and sanctions. The administration and its allies should step up efforts with allies to detect, interdict, or otherwise thwart Iran's illicit procurement efforts that violate national and international laws. At the same time, the United States and its allies should take steps to better detect and block Iranian cooperation with North Korea on ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and conventional arms. They should also devote more intelligence resources to determining if North Korea and Iran are cooperating on nuclear programs or transferring nuclear or nuclear-related technology, equipment, or materials. Beyond the short-term problems, The Iran deal has fundamental long-term deficiencies that need to be addressed. Which problems to focus on and how to remedy them should be part of an Iran policy review by the Trump administration and Congress. Two priorities are extending the nuclear limitations in the deal and limiting Iran's ballistic missile. One suggestion covering the former is to maintain a 12-month breakout requirement forever. Since I've run out of time, let me end there. Thank you.
Mr. Modo.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to come back and discuss what I would call the next generation of Iran pushback. I've testified here before, and I think I'm in the consensus, I would say, that the last 8 years has been overly passive, and I've pushed forward ideas thinking that there are ways, tools we have and ways which we can push back against what we often call the Iranian Action Network that have been overlooked and ignored as a result of an overly accommodating policy over the last 8 years. A lot of the recommendations I have in here are on the basis of things that I've already seen that we have, that just need to be dusted off and sharpened. Tools we've used in the past, ways in which we can improve on what we already, what already exists. But going back to the overarching theme of putting Iran on notice, I think that former National Security Advisor Flynn did the right thing. I think there needs to be follow-up in that regard, follow-up on what the new rules of engagement are, follow-up in terms of making very clear to the Iranians that escalation, that we have a very clear intent of reestablishing escalation dominance, of changing the nature of dynamics between the U.S. and the Iranians in the Gulf and other places, and Yemen as well. But I also think that I don't think that we've done nearly enough to point out the fact that while the original hostage crisis was in 1979, there's another hostage crisis. The Iranian regime continues to take Iranian Americans and Canadian Americans and other hyphenated Iranians hostage. It's become a systematic policy by the IRGC. And for those businesses, particularly foreign businesses that are looking to get back into Iran, I think that needs to be part of, I guess, an overhaul of our media offensive and making clear about the dangers and risks, not only to reputation, but literal risks of doing business in Iran. So I think Iran needs to be put in notice on various other dimensions. The other thing I would say is know your customer and due diligence. My understanding from foreign businesses, large multinationals that are going into Iran, that those requirements are actually rather easy to satisfy. I think this committee might consider ways of enhancing those, making those stricter, raising the bar for companies that are looking to get back in. The IRGC has done a very good job of cloaking itself, 2 or 3 degrees removed from the core, so that businesses, can avoid that type of risk. But I think that they're ensconced in ways that ordinary businesses don't know, and they're not being held liable to actually verify. Corruption, I think, is the one thing that gets at the heart of all Iranians. To the extent that you're going to move Iranians, channel that anger, and get them to do more inside and outside of Iran to stand up and protest, I really think that we need to do a much better job of systematically pointing out how deep corruption is. And I think that there are certain ways of doing that, not only by overhauling what I said, the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, and actually returning to the day when those were tools that were part of U.S.-Iran policy, but also on U.S. government websites. I think that there needs to be putting businesses on notice as well. I also think partners, proxies, and allies of the Iranian government as well need to be put on notice, and there are a lot of ways which we can do that, and Chairman Royce mentioned some of those in some of the war zones in which we're all familiar. I look forward to expanding on some of these ideas, most of which I've mentioned in my testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to the committee today. I've been asked to present testimony on Iran, and I'll do so in my capacity as the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy during the Obama administration. I left the Department of Defense last month, and my testimony today was cleared by the Department to ensure what I tell you remains at the appropriate level of classification and as boring as possible for the rest of you listening in, but I'll do my best to talk about things within the constraints that have been given. The United States has 3 vital interests in the Middle East: the security of the State of Israel, countering terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and freedom of navigation and commerce in and around the Arabian Peninsula, which all of you know is the home to vast hydrocarbon reserves. Iran can and does pose a threat to all of those interests, and it does so in 3 ways. its nuclear program, its buildup of conventional arms, and what we call its asymmetric activities, its support to proxies such as Hezbollah or some of the Shia militias in Iraq. During the Obama administration, we countered Iran through what we called our 4 Ps, our posture, our plans, our partners, and our preparedness. With respect to posture, we have about 35,000 troops in and around the Persian Gulf alone. We have major air bases in Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. We have a major naval base in Bahrain. And these bases and the troops operating out of them allow us to both ensure freedom of navigation in and around the Arabian Peninsula, combat terror groups, for many of these forces are in the skies above Iraq and Syria right now, and deter conventional Iranian aggression against our Gulf partners. We maintain a robust suite of plans to respond to regional contingencies. In my capacity at the Pentagon, I reviewed these plans. They are real, they are resourced, and our forces are ready to execute them. Over the past 3 decades, meanwhile, we have invested in our regional partnerships, specifically building partnership capacity in our Gulf partners. We have a long way to go, but one of the areas where we've made the most progress, ballistic missile defense, helps us counter Iran's buildup of conventional weapons. We also engaged in unprecedented levels of defense and intelligence cooperation with Israel, while making available some of our most advanced U.S.-made weapons to Gulf partners. Finally, we have preparedness, and we chose this word because we needed a 4th P for people like me to remember. But what this really stands for are the many dozens of bilateral, unilateral, multilateral exercises we conduct on an annual basis to help us prepare for regional contingencies. So how are we doing? I'll be blunt in my assessment and then offer some words of advice for this new administration, as well as some words of caution for this committee. Specifically, I'll argue that this administration's strategic flirtation with Russia is incompatible with what I assess to be its desire to pressure and counter Iran. First, the Department of Defense did not play a role in negotiating the nuclear deal with Iran, but the deal very much helps the U.S. military. Despite all of the Sturm und Drang here in Washington and elsewhere in the summer of 2015, most strategic planners I've spoken with, both here and in the region, see the deal as offering real positive opportunities, both for the United States and for Iran. As you know, the Pentagon was always in charge of providing the enforcement mechanism for U.S. policy. If Iran cheats, we'll know about it, and the Pentagon is prepared to act accordingly. From our perspective, then, the nuclear deal was a pretty good deal because it constrained Iran while placing no such constraints on us. Iran also has some opportunities, of course, and it appears to be largely squandering them. Some optimists in the Obama administration had hoped the nuclear negotiations would be a way to bring Iran in from the cold, so to speak, and encourage Iran to play a more helpful role regionally. The view of these optimists was not universally shared within the administration. Many of us argued within the administration and to our allies that the reason we needed to sign a deal with Iran was not because Iran is a benign actor, but because they're a malign actor, and thus needed to be prevented from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Iran's actions since signing the nuclear deal have vindicated the pessimists. Iran continues a robust buildup of conventional weapons, including what we military folks call anti-access aerial denial weapons like anti-ship cruise missiles and air defense systems. And while I don't think our own military commanders are losing sleep over these weapons just yet, I know our regional partners are. And here's my first word of caution. These weapon systems, for the most part, are not indigenous to the Islamic Republic of Iran. These are Russian weapons sold by Russia to Iran with the aim of constraining U.S. freedom of maneuver in strategically important waterways and airways. Any serious effort to counter the buildup of these Iranian capabilities has to take Russia into account. Iran is also continuing what I would call its asymmetric activities. Its support to Shia and allied militia in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen continues. The presence of anti-ship cruise missiles in Yemen is especially concerning since it threatens a key commercial waterway, the Bab el-Mandeb. And let me be blunt again regarding the administration's overtures to Russia. In Syria, it will be exceptionally difficult and likely impossible to reach any accommodation with Russia and the regime in Damascus that does not end up strengthening Iran and its proxies, including Hezbollah. So before the administration goes down that path, they should recognize that in the short term at least, they're going to embolden some of the very people they've pledged to counter in the region. And they will embolden Iran and these groups to the detriment of Israel's security. In Iraq, meanwhile, the Islamic State is on a clear path to defeat. But the long-term threat to Iraq's sovereignty is both Kurdish separatism and the Shia militias, many of them supported by Iran, that exist only loosely affiliated with the Iraqi state. In addition, Iraq's long-term stability will be dependent on the United States being able to keep a small contingent of trainers and special operators in the country, which is why the president's dismissive comments about the Iraqi government, his comments about how we should have taken Iraq's oil, and his ban on Iraqis coming to the United States have been so strategically misguided. This all plays into a narrative of an Iran that very much views Iraq as a zero-sum game with the United States. It spent millions of dollars to convince Iraqis that we have the types of malign activities towards Iraq that the president seems to in fact have, but with few others share. If the United States wants to push back on that, it needs to do so in the president's words and with robust diplomacy. I would also caution this administration from trying to push back against Iran and its proxies in Iraq right now. We have a Sunni terrorist enemy to defeat in Iraq, and our 5,000 soldiers in Iraq need to focus on them, not on war with Iran's proxies. I fought in Iraq, and as any of you who fought there remember, Iran can make our life pretty miserable. So we don't need that fight right now, and we should sequence how we push back on them. Finally, a few words on Yemen. We've talked about Islamic fundamentalism, but I'm somewhat of a freedom of navigation fundamentalist. The United States should be prepared to robustly counter any threats to key waterways, and I'm not going to lose any sleep if a couple of Houthis die because they made an error of firing an anti-ship cruise missile into the Bab el-Mandeb. I should note, though, that the vast majority of commercial traffic, 1,400 vessels, 80 million tons on a monthly basis that flows through the Bab el-Mandeb is not American. It comes from the European Union, India, China, Korea. These are the countries that have the most at stake in any actions which threaten shipping, and before the administration escalates a war in Yemen, it should start with some multilateral diplomacy telling Iran, in essence, to knock it off, let their own commercial interests be at stake. In conclusion, in Secretary Mattis, we have a Secretary of Defense who keenly understands the threat posed by Iran. And in Secretary Tillerson and Gary Cohn, we have, respectively, a Secretary of State and a Director of the Economic Council who understand the centrality of market access to hydrocarbon resources in the Gulf to the global economy. So there's some cause for optimism that this administration will eventually put together a coherent strategy to counter Iran's malign activities in a way that serves U.S. interests. But the contradictions in the administration's strategic initiatives thus far, not to mention the alarming and unprecedented dysfunction within the national security decision-making process, leave plenty of room for worry as well. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to go over.
Thank you, Mr. Exum. Thank you to the panel. One of the questions I was going to direct at Mr. Albright concerned a portion of your testimony where you said that the previous administration interfered in U.S. law enforcement efforts when it came to them blocking the efforts to arrest and convict Iranians and their agents engaged in breaking U.S. export and sanctions laws. One of the focuses I have is sort of inversing that policy, especially with respect to the IRGC. But what measures can we take to send the signal that extraditing and arresting and convicting those that are involved in breaking our laws has to be a priority?
Well, first thing, I think some of these memos and extradition requests should be revisited. I mean, they still exist. Some cases may still be active. I mean, these are not public cases. The other, and I must say, one of the impacts that I heard very clearly was that this in a sense, interfering in what the investigators were doing in our enforcement agencies was discouraging. And these are hard cases to launch, and they hesitate to do more. So I think the administration should send a very strong signal that it fully supports these investigations and prosecutions of these Iranian agents.
So that would have to be through state, since it was the State Department.
That's right. Well, that's where they tended to
on it.
die.
Yeah.
Yes, that's where they tended. And so, but I think it has to be done at the White House level, and and to get these cases moving again. And because I think my understanding is Iran hasn't stopped its illicit activities, and it's very important to counter them.
Well, another way to counter it, and I'll go to Ms. Bauer's comment here, but I bet there'd be a tremendous ripple effect from sanctioning just one or two European companies for transactions with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're the main economic player in Iran. And I think you had a line in your testimony where you said that the application of U.S. secondary sanctions for dealing with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps remains a significant risk for companies looking to re-engage with Iran, and that this application of secondary sanctions has never been done. So another question is, why not, and what would the impact be if our response now to their missile tests, and maybe to General Soleimani's trip 2 days ago to Moscow, is such a robust action. And let's push that button there for there.
Thank you, Chairman. Indeed, the remaining sanctions on the IRGC and the fact that they include secondary sanctions risks remains a great deterrent to businesses looking to re-engage with Iran. And in fact, that is one reason I think why you haven't seen action against a European company in particular, is that they do not want to lose access to the U.S. financial system, and so they're able to look at the OFAC list and ensure that they don't do business with anyone on that list or anyone who holds a 50% share or an aggregated 50% share of a business they're working with. So they're able to do some due diligence where they're not confident with the due diligence. It appears that they're not engaging, but there are things that could be done to make it harder and to isolate the IRGC further. For example, designating additional IRGC affiliates to make it clear to those companies going in.
So maybe with less than a 50% ownership share, but you could expand that out, or you're saying there's affiliates out there that we haven't captured yet?
There are affiliates who haven't been listed. Even those that are not listed by operation of law, companies are restricted or could be sanctioned for doing business.
Why don't we do this on that answer? Why don't I just ask the panel if you have ideas on that, if you could give me some specifics. And I could just get to this Soleimani question, which I wanted to ask, because it was a surprise to me, you know, to see him travel again to Moscow. This is the third time he's done it. And as a matter of fact, he's there right now. And I would just ask the panel for any creative solutions for effectively pushing back on his continued travel. And the thing I find most objectionable here is that he's been you know, fingered as the fellow behind the death of many Americans, the one who plotted the Russian-Iranian tag team slaughter that went on in Iran, or went on in Syria in the middle of the Iranian negotiations. I mean, there have been so much that this guy, as head of the Quds forces, which is in charge of assassinations outside the country, has been responsible for attacks across Europe and so forth, where they take out anybody perceived to be an enemy of the regime. I mean, this is a really bloodthirsty guy, and it seems to me that the reason he's headed to Moscow for these meetings has got to be the ballistic missile systems or other weapon systems that he intends to introduce into the theater. So ideas on how to react to that. Maybe Mr. Modal, do you have a...
One of the things that I've thought, and again, what I hear from Iranians all the time is, why is the U.S. government not doing more to come up with a large matrix of all IRGC officials that we know of, businesses that we know that are linked, and publicize it constantly, and to show their links to corruption? I mean, this isn't necessarily going to directly address the Soleimani issue, but I think it's going to significantly weaken the IRGC. So when you're talking about publicizing the like any...
Well, I think this cuts into another point you made in your testimony here about the need to make some changes of the broadcasting into Iran, so that, yes, it's objective, but we do touch on issues that's important there, such as... you know, we've now got a single head of the agency who has the ability to sort of direct information. And so as information spells out about corruption or whatever, that access to that information on social media and on a platform of radio and television should be available, so that people know exactly what has happened here with respect to the IRGC taking all of these assets, usually through nationalization, and transferring them to their ownership of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. I need to go to Mr. Engel. My time's expired. Thank you very much, panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Exum, let me ask you this. In your testimony, you pointed out one way in which Russia and Iran collaborate to destabilize the Middle East. You mentioned that Russia provides Iran with anti-access, area denial weapons, like anti-ship cruise missiles, and air defense systems. Obviously, this is very disconcerting to us and our allies, because their goal is having and using these weapons to inhibit freedom of movement in strategic waterways and airways. There have been Russian media reports that Iran and Russia are in discussions over a $10 billion deal in weapons. How would you suggest the Trump administration respond to this?
Well, I think one of the things that the Trump administration can do, and here with respect to sanctions, I'd defer to the sanctions experts because I'm sure that there are aspects outside of the military lane that you can use. I think with respect to diplomacy, I'll just focus on diplomacy and the military steps that I think you can take. With respect to diplomacy, by constraining the access to waterways and look, we don't need the oil that's coming out of the oil and gas that's coming out of the Persian Gulf as much as the global markets need them, and as much as we need them for the stability of the global economy. So it's not just the United States or the Trump administration that has a stake in this, that has a stake in freedom of navigation and freedom of commerce in and around the Arabian Peninsula. I would think that you would start with a large multilateral effort to pressure Iran on the deployment of these weapon systems and on Russia on the sales of these weapon systems. From a military perspective, we're already doing quite a lot. Again, I don't think that the commander of NAVCENT would argue that his freedom of movement is in any way constrained right now, but it's clear that we need to do two things. We need to increase the degree to which we have ballistic and air missile or integrated air and missile defense systems within the Middle East. That includes both sales to partners and increasing partner capacity, but it also means that our partners in the region need to get more serious about their own maritime capabilities. Historically, maritime capabilities, the Navy has been the third of three services within most of our Gulf militaries. They need to get serious about their own efforts to be able to keep the waterways in and around the Arabian Peninsula secure. And I would defer again, like I said, to my Treasury colleagues and my colleagues from the Washington Institute with respect to what more we can do in terms of sanctioning those Russian businesses or those Iranians that are purchasing these types of weapon systems, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you. Anybody else have comments on that?
Mr. Ranking Member, the only thing I would say is it's a very asymmetric process that Iran is involved in. That includes commercial acquisition of conventional military stuff. I think, building on what Dr. Exum is saying, I think we have not done enough to work with our allies in the region, particularly in the GCC, who is often the site of enabling Iran to do these things through front companies based in their own emirates, for instance, to develop the capabilities to work asymmetrically in a defensive capacity. And I don't think that we're systematically oriented in that sense.
Thank you. Mr. Albright, let me ask you this. You've criticized the IAEA for a lack of transparency in reporting, and I quote you, this is what you said, "The IAEA reporting continues to lack critical technical details about implementation of the agreement. This lack of information in the IAEA reports, combined with the secrecy surrounding the decision-making of the Joint Commission, is a serious shortcoming in the implementation of the JCPOA and erodes support for this important deal," unquote. Let me ask you this. What information is missing from IAEA reporting, and what information do you need to be made public? What specific recommendations do you have for the Trump administration and Congress to encourage more transparency so that experts like you can better evaluate the implementation?
Well, in my testimony, there's a footnote. I apologize for making it a footnote, but essentially the IA is not reporting on almost any of the technical details that it used to report on, levels of enriched uranium, controversies with Iran. I mean, Iran's pushing limits of the JCPOA. IA may or may not be pushing back, but it could report on the status of that. So I would say that they're providing almost very little information. On heavy water, we hear a lot, well, they're over, the cap of 130 tons by 100 kilograms. They leave out 70 tons was sent off to Oman in a kind of a clever trick that in essence allowed Iran to be 70 tons over the cap on heavy water if you judge that cap by the heavy water Iran owns and controls. So I think that it not only there's a lack of information inhibiting analysis, the lack of information, I think, is providing a false narrative about where things are at, and we need a lot more information. Now, I will say under pressure, some from Congress, some from us, some from the media, the Joint Commission did decide in December to start releasing its major decisions publicly. I mean, I don't think they wanted to do that, but I think that they felt the absolute need to do it. And so I think pressure does work in this case, and I think the Trump administration should push for much more openness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go to Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for, again, providing us the information and a focus on a very significant element to our nation's security. And so thank you both. And I would identify myself certainly with your opening statement. I am, however, and this panel has not changed my, I don't know if it's observation or my analysis that, frankly, our policy toward Iran and the mullah regime in Iran has been detached from reality, and it's basically wishful thinking of the worst sort. Let me just mention about Russia and how they have armed the mullah regime, this horrible dictatorship, with weapons to shoot planes out of the air and take care of that type of military threat. Quite frankly, we are not going to invade Iran. I don't see it. Even if they have a bomb, we're not going to invade Iran. Those weapons are aimed at preventing some sort of, or countering a military threat to that regime, which now has a positive relationship with Moscow. That if we are going to get rid of the mullah regime, it won't be U.S. military personnel with U.S. weapons going in and doing that job. If we're going to get rid, and unfortunately, all the talk about that, and all the details about every little increment in which the Iranian mullah regime now is closer to getting a bomb, has taken us away from the real solution, the only solution, which is make sure that we deal with the people of Iran who hate the mullahs. And you're taking focus away from that by talking about weapon systems and this. We need to make, while we let the Baluch, who would be in charge of the Straits of Hormuz, I might add, if we support their fight against the mullah regime. The Kurds, there are more Kurds in Iran than there are in Iraq. The Azaris, we have Azerbaijan right next door that's willing to help. But all of this time, and even the Persian element was ready to overthrow the mullahs several years ago in this Green Revolution, and we let them go without any even verbal support for their effort. Now, getting rid of the mullah regime by helping the people of Iran is the answer. You've got Persians, the MEK, I know, as everybody criticizes them because they have a checkered past. Well, they've been willing to help us get rid of the mullah regime, and they've been struggling for a more democratic government, along with the other Persians who are there. 90% of the Persians don't like it, and like you said, as you expect from a journalist, to focus in on the corruption and the repression that's going on. Well, if we focus on that, that's how we would mobilize the only real power we have to get rid of them, which is the Iranian people themselves. And one last note about this idea about all this focus on how much heavy water they have, et cetera, et cetera. We gave them $150 billion with this nonsensical treaty that we signed with them. $150 billion were made at their disposal. How much do you think it would cost them to buy a nuclear weapon from Pakistan? It wouldn't cost, I bet it wouldn't even cost $1 billion. I bet they could get it for in the tens of millions, if not $100 million bucks. The fact is, that regime, with its hands on the military capability of nuclear weapons, that is the threat. It's the regime. It's not the weapon itself. So I think we should quit focusing America's attention on things that will not change the situation and make us any safer. And again, talking about how much heavy water they have and how are they going to be able to stop them from building their own bomb. If they want a bomb, now they can afford to buy it. And we have, the answer is mullahs have got to go. The mullah regime has to leave, and how we get rid of it is not through American military operations, but instead reaching out to the people of Iran and helping them win their freedom. And if anybody in the panel would like to spend their time refuting that, please go right ahead. How about my journalistic friend? Go right ahead.
Well, sir, first off, thank you for that. I mean, I'll be. I'll be blunt. First off, you know, if it were to come to those types of activities, and I well know your biography, I know your experience, you would know that the Department of Defense, this is not within our wheelhouse, so to speak. You know, any outreach towards separatist movements is usually done either clandestinely or through overtly through diplomatic channels, and there have certainly been examples where we have done that. I think with respect to, I will focus on one thing, which is the note about the dollars that Iran has. First off, you know, Iran always has the cash on hand if they wanted to, you know, purchase a nuclear weapon. I think, and I hate to do this, I'm putting on my PhD hat now. There's a lot of academic literature and a lot of analysis that would suggest that's not a really likely thing. Because if you're the Pakistanis, if you sell a nuclear weapon to somebody, first off, you lose all of the control that you would have on that nuclear weapon, and you'd get all of the blowback if it's used. So I think that threat, although it's real and it's something that we carefully monitor, it's something that contains a lot of risk for anybody that would sell that. Second thing I would say is that when it comes to money and what the Iranians are doing in terms of the asymmetric activities, in terms of these nefarious activities, a lot of these things are really cheap, and they didn't need the money to keep doing this stuff. What they're doing in Yemen, what they're doing in Syria and Iraq, it's not that expensive to begin with. And as we've established, if the Quds Force wants to get a piece of the budget, they're going to get a piece of the budget. They're going to get their way, and thus far they've gotten their way with respect to I guess what we call the Islamic regime's discretionary spending, and I don't think that the amount of money that was freed up, which is a little less when you look at actually the liquid assets, has had much of an effect on what Qasem Soleimani and his lieutenants are doing in Iraq and Syria.
We go now to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, makes some interesting points, and the chairman was quite indulgent with him on time. I hope that inspires a whole new approach.
Well, it's certainly with respect to Mr. Brad Sherman, it does.
So thank you. Because I do want to deal with some of the points he raises. But before I do that, in some minds, the picture of the Islamic Republic of Iran, of this regime, is the smiling face of its foreign minister, Javad Zarif, dapper, debonair, in Geneva. The real face of this regime, the real picture of this regime, is Alan Kurdi, that 3-year-old boy on the beach in Turkey on the Mediterranean, one of 400,000 Syrians who died as a result of the Islamic Republic's support for the butcher in Damascus. I, for one, don't think that we can excuse Russian arms sales to Iran on the theory that we're going to achieve regime change anytime soon. We've watched the Arab Spring. We've seen which regimes survive and which don't. Those regimes that have 50,000 thugs willing to machine gun their own citizens survive. Those whose army is unwilling to do that and who are confronted by their own people don't. And we've had other panels, so I won't ask this panel. I've been assured by other panels that there are tens of thousands of Quds Force soldiers willing to machine gun other Iranians if that's what it takes to keep this regime in force. The gentleman from California says that the weapons that Russia is selling are only defensive, it wouldn't affect us, but of course the S-300s are the anti-aircraft weapons that make it much more difficult for Israel or even the United States to take out this nuclear program if that becomes necessary. And the fact that all options are on the table is the only thing that keeps Iran from not cheating more on the JCPOA, and one of the only things that got him to sign it. But I want to focus on the gentleman from California's idea of buying a nuclear weapon. He mentions Pakistan, but Pakistan might well listen to their friends in Saudi Arabia. If they have a bomb for sale, maybe they would sell it there. They're a Middle Eastern country, or nearly one, and would be directly affected. I want to focus a little bit about our friends in North Korea. The death of Kim Jong-nam illustrates that we should never have taken North Korea off the state sponsor of terrorism list. North Korea provided the kit that was used to create a nuclear bomb-making facility that was destroyed by Israel, located in Syria, destroyed by Israel last decade. Do any of our panelists have any idea how much money North Korea got in return, not for a nuclear weapon, but just a kit to build one? Technology, I'm seeing 4 shaking heads. But I would point out that North Korea is in need of cash. The Iran has some already loaded on pallets wrapped in cellophane, and I know that Iran would want the indigenous capacity. I know that they would want more than one weapon. But will any of you comment why has Iran not purchased a weapon from North Korea, knowing now that North Korea has a few more weapons than they need to defend themselves from us? They could afford to part with one. Mr. Albright.
Yeah, I think there's worry. I mean, and a nuclear weapon can be transferred in different ways. It doesn't have to be a fully commissioned.
Yeah,
workable.
it could be just the fissile. They could sell the fissile material. They could sell the weapon. They could
That's right.
sell
And I think there's a
the
lot of
two
worry.
separately.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of worry, and I think it needs to be looked at. Just what is the level of cooperation? I mean, I don't know of credible evidence right now saying that Iran and North Korea are cooperating on nuclear weapons related or nuclear weapons issues, but there's a lot of cooperation on missiles. They have common enemies, and I think it needs to be looked at much more.
Do any of you have an opinion on whether the Syria-North Korea transaction of last decade would have inevitably involved Iranian observers, advisors, or cash? Anyone have an opinion on that?
There's been statements or some evidence that Iran would have had some involvement in it. I was never able to confirm direct involvement, but given the closeness of Iran and Syria, fortunately that reactor doesn't exist anymore, and there could certainly cooperation could have
I'm going to try
grown.
to sneak in one more question, which is indulgent of the chairman, but and comment that we need to prevent U.S. banks from financing any aircraft sales to Iran, because that creates an incentive for U.S. banks to come here and lobby us in favor of Iran to make sure they get repaid. The press reports are of discussions of a $10 billion military hardware deal between Russia and Iran, including tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The JCPOA says Iran can't buy those kinds of weapons without the approval of a secret 5-member, a committee that operates in secret, but we have a seat on that and can veto such sales. Is there any possibility that the United States would approve any or fail to veto any transfer of weapons from Russia to Iran?
Yeah, I don't think so. If I can say that, the problem is that ban ends after 5 years or earlier if the IA issues its broader conclusion on the additional protocols. So I think it's one of the, really it's this duration issue transcends nuclear to conventional and ballistic missile. And it's something the Trump administration is going to have to factor in strongly into its policy review on Iran of how do we deal with these exemptions that in essence take place in not that distant future.
I'll get one more comment and then I'll yield back.
No,
No, I will yield back.
let's do this. Let's
I will yield
get back to 5 minutes, and let's start with Steve Shabbat on that front of Ohio.
Thanks a lot, Mr.
Thank you for your indulgence.
As we all know, ultimately the president became aware, because most of us didn't like or agree with the Iran deal, ended up taking action on his own. And some would argue that the previous administration, the Obama administration, had so much invested in the deal that they overlooked provocative actions, overlooked arguably a whole series of flagrant violations of the deal itself, and Iran pretty much got away with murder, I think, literally in some cases, but figuratively also. I'd just kind of like to go down the line and see what do you think of what a lot of people think about this, the fact that the administration did overlook far too much some of those things which you've already commented on here today, because this was one of their great accomplishments, something some people thought couldn't be done. So I'll start with you, Ms. Power.
In terms of potential violations or on the margins of the JCPOA, I think it's important to consider proportional responses. In my testimony, there's a section where I look at the use of proportional responses to what the previous administration may have called deviations in terms of compliance with the deal, but this administration might be more inclined to call violations. And so I think it's important to have options available short of abrogating the deal. Those could be things like not approving decisions that come in front of the Joint Commission, or suspending licensing, not the licenses themselves perhaps, but suspending licensing under the agreement until such issues are resolved.
Mr. Albright.
Yeah, no, I think my criticisms are fairly well known. I thought the conditions should have been stronger in many cases. I mean, I did not support the deal despite kind of a lobbying effort on the part of the administration. And I had supported publicly the JPA, but I thought that there were several cases, conditions that were just not strong enough where I could support them. I didn't come out against it. I have since, with implementation, I've become more critical of that I think too many concessions were made. Many more no's should have been given rather than yeses. And I think it's made the situation more difficult to deal with. And one of the challenges for the Trump administration is going to be to kind of reverse this. And I think it's going to be challenging. And I think the things I put in my testimony are things, the short-term things are things to do today. I mean, obviously you can't get them all, but there's a lot of opportunities to start changing the nature of the implementation that can start today, and the U.S. has the power to do it. But I do think that it's going to be tough. Then there's this issue of there's these problems. I mentioned one, and Congressman Rohrabacher, in a sense, is alluding to them, is that the duration is a real problem in this agreement. I mean, I wish 10 years was a long period of time in the Middle East, but it's not. And in some sense, the major limitations of the deal start to unwind quicker than it took to negotiate this deal, if you go back to the start point is 2003. And so you have a real problem of how to now the administration deal with these conditions that are going to unwind in the future with conventional weapons, ballistic missiles.
Thank you. Let me cut you off there, because some of us are being held to 5 minutes.
Okay,
So, Mr. Riddell.
No, to a couple of things to Mr. Rohrabacher's point. I think that the deal is actually a large setback to those in and outside of Iran who were eager to see us to actually do things that would lead to momentum for channeling resistance against the regime. And I think, you know, everything from 2009 when the Green Movement started happening, and there was a moratorium on dealing with members of the Green Movement and actually aiding people as they were trying to channel resentment and figure out how to take disparate clusters of resistance and form an actual resistance movement for the first time in 35 years at the time. It was a tremendous failing, and was all in the interest of ill-conceived rapprochement and the nuclear deal. I won't comment on the nuclear deal in particular, but the one thing I think is important to consider is it was the deal itself, in a sense, from an intel perspective or a law enforcement perspective, was a real setback, because now everyone is so eager to preserve the deal that we're putting the brakes on and we're cautiously walking around the idea of law enforcement, and a human-enabled law enforcement. Verification of this deal is critical. And I think to the extent that the CIA and the intelligence community were actually on the right path of developing better ways of working with law enforcement, detecting, disrupting, and dismantling counterproliferation networks, there's been a setback to that degree. And I think now we have an uphill climb in terms of verification and counterproliferation.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Can Dr. Exum respond?
Mr.
I'll
Chairman,
leave it
with
up to
your
you.
permission, could I briefly respond?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. First off, Congressman, I believe we overestimated the degree to which the diplomatic channel we established between Secretary Kerry and Zarif could bear fruit outside of the nuclear negotiations. I think we thought it could. Bottom line is it didn't. They didn't want to talk about anything except for the nuclear deal. Second, in terms of pushing back against other things Iran was doing, there were lots of reasons having nothing to do with the nuclear deal why we didn't. In Syria, the president, as you all know, took several options off the table in terms of what we could do in Syria. In Iraq, we had a fight against the Islamic State to prosecute that we didn't want to endanger by pushing back against Iran too soon. And then third, in Yemen, I don't think the administration wanted to get drawn any deeper into Yemen. It's actually in Yemen, and specifically with respect to the threat to freedom of navigation, where I think we could have been more aggressive and think that would have made sense. But I think the administration got it right on Iraq.
We now go to Mr. Greg Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to examine our policy towards Iran. I think that this will be our 7th full committee hearing on Iran in the past year, and I appreciate the opportunity to and understand the threat that Iran poses to the Middle East, and I know that we'll have further questions. However, I must also say with this, with the ongoing new administration and President Trump's bizarre policies toward Mr. Putin and Russia, as you've said, Mr. Chairman, has demonstrated that Russia has demonstrated that the hope of cooperation could not survive the cold calculation of his narrow interests. I would hope that, and I know that we're going to have some hearing or a hearing on Russia in a couple of weeks or so, but I hope that we have more focus on Russia and its involvement because it seems to be threatening our very democracy. It's come out clearly about the Russians' involvement in our elections for the President of the United States here in America, and Russia's involvement in France and in Germany and those elections there. And it seems to me that there is a great threat of what Russia is doing around the world. And being a committee that has gotten together, and I see the Senate is starting to move on that side in a bipartisan way to start talking about where Russia is and what Russia is doing, and whether it's in Iran or other places around the world, and what the connections are between Russia and our current administration. Because it seems as though every day there are more ties to Russia's intelligence services that are being discovered at the highest level of our national security apparatus. So I would think that this committee, and one of the things that I do like about this committee, is that we work in a bipartisan way, that we would be the committee, since it does not seem that anybody on the House side, I do see some senators on the other side of the aisle starting to talk about doing something. But I would hope that, and I don't hear any committee or anything being done on the House side. I know that when we had Benghazi, et cetera, there was other committees that stood up and did certain things that they're in for investigation. I would hope then that the Foreign Affairs Committee, in a bipartisan way, would step up and say there's a threat to our democracy, and we hold many hearings. In fact, we could lead Congress in coming together to say that we're going to look into what's happening in Russia and Russia's narrow interest and how they're affecting us here in the United States of America, and look at what the president's positions have been and the people that are affiliated with him. Because just recently, just even yesterday, it comes out that even during the campaign, there's been many individuals from the Trump campaign that had some contact with Russia, and clearly when we had General Flynn, who had to leave because of his connections with Russia. So I think that it provides a unique opportunity for us to have some continuous hearings on Russia and its relationship and contact with the United States, what it is doing, what it is not doing, its connections with the current administration. That conversation is very important to every American, whether you're Democrat, whether you're Republican, whether you're independent. It is something that I think is going to the heart, and as the camera of history rolls, it will be looking back on what did we do in the United States Congress? What did we do do at the time that our own democracy was threatened by an outside entity? Did we fully investigate and go into it as an independent body, a separate branch of government, to make sure that we've done everything to protect ourselves? So, you know, it is good that we need to talk because we could even
will the
talk
gentleman yield?
We could even talk about, not because I only got a minute left, and I know we're only getting to 5.
I understand.
We could even talk about, you know, Russia, you know, and I think that we've had some of these conversations about Russia and its involvement with reference to Iran. Clearly, you know, we've heard questions here today talking about Russia providing ballistic missiles to Iran. We've talked and heard about that had Russia had discussions over $10 billion in military hardware. So that's, you know, a problem to us, even as you talk about dealing with Iran. And then when you figure out, you know, Russia and the consequences of the U.S. and Russian cooperation, which is, this administration has expressed openness to U.S. cooperation with Russia in Syria. And how does that affect us in Iran? And can you do an agreement with Russia? What is this deal with Russia and this administration? We've got to get to the bottom of this, and I think there's nothing more important for us as members of the legislative branch and the Foreign Affairs Committee for us to focus on where, what, when, and how Russia is involved with this administration. I yield back.
Well, thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Even before this week's events, I've been discussing with Ranking Member Engel a hearing focused on the way in which Russia works to undermine Western democracies, including the United States, including France and Germany, and including efforts to undermine NATO. As the intelligence reports from January noted, they did that here. They'll do it again in the upcoming European elections in France and Germany. So it's appropriate that we hear from experts on the appropriate steps to be taken in response. And this will continue the critical oversight role that our committee has played on U.S.-Russia policy. I'll remind the members that we have had hearings specifically on Russia and its aggressive acts in the past. And after all, this is the committee that led the way to impose sanctions on Russia. We did that after its invasion of Ukraine, and this is the committee that has been sounding the alarm about Russia's weaponization of information, if you go through the hearings that we've had on RT. And I'd expect that to be the first hearing we hold after next week's recess, as I have shared with Mr. Engel. I appreciate the gentleman's observations. We now go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for continuing to focus on the real and serious threat of Iran. As recent events have indicated, and as you both have pointed out, Iran's provocative actions have not subsided in this post-nuclear deal world. And in fact, in many aspects, its illicit activity seems to have been on the rise. Iran remains a direct threat to our national security, to our friend and ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, and to the stability of the entire Middle East. Often lost in the discussion of the JCPOA or Iran's ballistic missile tests is how closely this all mirrors North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Our Middle East Subcommittee has convened several hearings on this topic in the last few weeks. North Korea and Iran have been suspected of having some level of nuclear cooperation. At the very least, Iran learned from the North Korea playbook on how to win concessions from the West and still get its nuclear weapons. But for certain, these two rogue regimes have a long history of collaboration on ballistic missile development. Iran's latest test was apparently of ballistic missiles of North Korean origin. This is a very dangerous alliance. We must not continue to view Iran and North Korea as two separate tracks. We have the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Nonproliferation Act, INCSNA, which now could be a valuable tool to prevent proliferation of nuclear, radiological, chemical, or ballistic missile material to these regimes. Unfortunately, the previous administration was severely deficient in its reporting requirements under INCSNA. A GAO report found that the administration was years behind in its reporting, years behind, which had the unfortunate consequence of delaying sanctions on proliferation activities by Iran. By doing so, the previous administration effectively blocked key sanctions against Iran while the nuclear negotiations were ongoing, much to our detriment. In order to be effective, we must fully and vigorously enforce sanctions, and we must look at ways of expanding them if we are to curb Iran's dangerous actions. And this includes, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, as you know, rigorous enforcement of the JCPOA, and it includes reimposing some sanctions lifted by the JCPOA that fell under more than just non-proliferation sanctions. And that is why I will introduce my Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Accountability Act, which will modify the existing law and give us greater flexibility to hold these regimes and those individuals and entities accountable for the proliferation of their illicit activity. So I asked the panel kindly, could you tell us a little bit more about the Iran-North Korea nexus and what that proliferation network looks like, especially as it relates to their ballistic missile collaboration? And finally, Mr. Albright, you discussed Iran repeatedly taking advantage of loopholes and going over the threshold on heavy water and low enriched uranium. For what purpose would Iran need to enrich more than the allotted 300-kilogram cap on low enriched uranium or 130 metric tons of heavy water? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member.
Let me, it's very hard to penetrate the Iran-North Korean cooperation. I think it's better left to closed hearings to really get into that. I mean, one thing that can be said, though, and it's a little bit of an answer to an earlier question, is I think it's very important for the United States to sanction companies in Europe and in China that are linked to providing goods to Iran or North Korea. I mean, I bring up the European side of this mainly because it's very hard for the European countries now to do that. Their sanctions or listing of companies can be challenged quite easily because of the nature of their system, and I think it's important that the U.S. Sanction European and Chinese companies. Now, in terms of taking advantage of the loopholes, and I listed several. Now, why would it need to enrich more? I mean, I don't think it does. I think it just wants to push the envelope, create precedents. It wants to undermine the limitations of the JCPOA that were, at least from the U.S. point of view, intended to be pretty robust on that limit. They want to be able to justify why they would need a large gas centrifuge program, and one of the ways they're going to try to do it is by developing an indigenous fuel fabrication capability that uses low-enriched uranium, which of course has to be tested. You have to go above the limit to make more enriched uranium for the test fuel. And by doing that, when the international community would want to stop enrichment, the justification for the enrichment would be deeply embedded in a civil nuclear argumentation, whether that's the original or the ultimate intention or not. So I think, again, it's for Iran.
Thank you, sir, and I'm sorry I was long-winded and ran out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr.
Thank
Jerry
you.
Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the Chairman's recitation of groundbreaking work done by this committee on Russia, and I agree with him. I guess the concern on this side of the aisle that could easily be reassured is, but moving forward. Minority wrote...
If the gentleman...
only if he suspends my time. If you suspend my time, I'm happy to yield. Because you only give me 5 minutes.
Mr. Connolly, go ahead.
All right.
Whatever point you make.
3 months ago, the minority wrote a letter to Elliot Engel, the ranking member, asking him to deliver it to the chairman, asking for immediate hearing, even before the inauguration, on this Russia connection. We have, to my knowledge, we have not received a reply. Earlier this week, Mr. Cicilline and all of the Democrats signed a letter asking that General Flynn be brought before this committee so we can get to, this committee can examine the foreign policy implications of what just happened. And I certainly look forward
to an answer on that request. So I associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Meeks that moving forward is what we're concerned about. And I continue to hear gratuitous slaps at the previous administration on the subject of Iran because the agreement wasn't all-encompassing. Dr. Exum, are agreements, bilateral or agreements between us and another country, are they typically all-encompassing? Is that the record?
No, they are not. And in this case, this one particularly.
So when we signed going back to the very first nuclear test ban treaty during the Kennedy administration with the then Soviet Union, you mean those agreements did not address human rights violations or Jewish immigration or gulags or misbehavior in other parts of the world that were causing us great grief?
Not only that, Congressman, I seem to recall that we still faced significant conventional overmatch on the continent of Europe.
So, well, certainly the JCPOA has failed, though, Dr. Exum. Isn't that right? I mean, every single metric set by the JCPOA has been violated by Iran or they've cheated, and we've caught them at it, right?
Well, I think with respect to the JCPOA, I think that there is room to push back against Iran in a more robust way, but we ought to do so with caution. Sanctions got us to the
Dr. Exum,
JCPOA.
is there a single metric they have not reached?
I would defer to the Energy Department and to the Department of State.
Enrichment of uranium, they reached the goal. The Iraq production facility, plutonium reactor, they filled it with cement. Shipping enriched material out of the country, they did it. Inspections, they've done it. I mean, by all accounts, they've pretty much met the metrics. Now, we have to monitor it, and I agree with my friends on the other side of the aisle. In fact, I've introduced legislation would create a Helsinki-like commission to do just that, so that it's kind of hopefully removed once from politics and partisanship. But compliance obviously remains an issue. But you can't argue JCPOA has been a failure. And that's why, after hearing all of the predictions for a year or more of how it would fail and they would cheat, and by the way, it would accelerate them as a nuclear power, surely you would agree that is not what happened. They're not closer to nuclear development today than before the JCPOA, are they?
No, that's exactly right. Now, Mr. Albright may have more to add, but as far as
I only have 1 minute and 24, and I have a feeling the chairman's going to be strict about it. Right. So let me talk about the Russia connection. How about we talk about the new president?
Sure.
And I listen with interest to your testimony. In some ways, this Russia connection makes it harder, not easier for us to try to deter or address Iranian behavior, does it not?
Well, I believe it absolutely does.
Please explicate.
Well, especially with respect to Syria, I think we have seen many disturbing, now on the one hand, the coalition in Syria, they are not as stable, the opposing coalition in Syria, they are not as stable as our own counter-Daesh coalition is. So there are some fissures between the Russians and the Iranians, for example, or between Hezbollah and the Russians. But I think I am growing increasingly alarmed by the degree to which their coalition activities in Syria have brought Russia and Iran closer together. We've certainly seen just images on social media of Russian Spetsnaz on the ground in Syria with Hezbollah patches on. In a way that alarms us in the same way that U.S. special operators on the ground in northeast Syria working with Kurdish groups alarms the Turks. And I think, quite frankly, we have reason to believe that Russia's introduction and escalation in Syria in the fall of 2015 made it more difficult, not easier, to push back against what Iran was doing in Syria and elsewhere in the region, sir.
I thank you.
We go now to Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you and Ranking Member Elliot Engel for your bipartisan approach to the issues that we're facing concerning Iran. I'm grateful that we had a bipartisan success in adding language to the National Defense Authorization Act to require an analysis of Iranian missile testing. The Trump administration took a good first step in designating Iranian missile proliferation networks in response to the recent test. More needs to be done. And for Ms. Bauer, what are your recommendations for near and short-term actions to address Iran's ballistic missile system?
Thank you. I think there are a lot of options to use the existing authorities, like the authority that was invoked in last month's action, to continue to identify procurement networks. What is especially impactful can be targeting those previously non-public affiliations between commercial fronts and Iranian actors, because these companies, these front companies, need to operate. They need to appear to be legitimate in order to procure dual-use goods. They need to hold bank accounts, and exposing them publicly can be incredibly disruptive.
And I appreciate that. And of course, what they're doing violates UN resolutions too. So this, it really is insulting in light of the Iranian nuclear deal that everything seems to continue. In fact, Mr. Albright, apologists for the dangerous Iranian nuclear deal claim, quote, if Iran cheats, comma, we will know it, end of quote. I agree with Mr. Rohrabacher earlier, who said this is wishful thinking, which puts American families at risk of attack. What is your assessment?
In the short term, with the program rolled back quite a bit, the chance of detecting cheating is pretty good. But in the longer term, I would say it's not, and that's why it's critical to, in a sense, really deal with this issue of access by the IEA. That Iran will have greater incentives to cheat in the future if it now can limit the ability of the IEA to access. And in the longer term, I mean, I don't think this deal can be verified after a certain number of rollbacks of the condition. If you're talking 10, 15 years from now, I think it'll be extremely difficult to verify this arrangement if Iran builds up its nuclear program as it's stated it is going to build up.
Well, to me, it's such wishful thinking. The notification, the number of days we have to provide, the fact that there are no Americans serving on the inspection teams. This is beyond wishful thinking. It's putting the American families at risk. Mr. Modell, Obama administration officials repeatedly, incorrectly, testified that the dangerous nuclear agreement would in no way impact our pressing Iran on human rights abuses and sanctioning those responsible for the brutal treatment of the Iranian people. However, there have been no designations for human rights abuses since the nuclear deal was implemented, despite continued calls from Congress to do so. What specific steps can the new administration take to press Iran on human rights?
First of all, in terms of, first thing is listing individuals for human rights abuses. The second thing, though, and I spent a great amount of time here on human rights abuses and terrorism and the other violations of the Iranian regime, but on human rights in particular, is to use the media tools that we're funding, that we're spending millions of dollars on every year, to highlight those things and to make it an integral part of U.S. policy, pressuring the regime from the outside.
And I appreciate so much Mr. Rohrabacher pointing out that the prior administration, we had such an opportunity with the Green Revolution. I have many friends in South Carolina, of all things Iranian Americans, who had such hopes for regime change to give opportunity the extraordinary people of the culture of Persia to be under a theocracy that is so debilitating and so threatening to all the neighbors. And with two sons who served in Iraq, I know firsthand where the IEDs came from. And anyone who has faced that understands, and this really follows too, something never to be forgotten, and that was the bombing of the Beirut Marine Barracks. Hundreds, 283 I believe, Americans murdered, and it was by the Iranian regime. The largest explosive device since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It should not be forgotten. I now yield to Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
I thank the chairman. First, Mr. Modell, I want to thank you for bringing up the issue of Iran's abduction of Iranian Americans, of dual nationals. I would also like to take this opportunity to note that March 9th will mark the 10th anniversary of the date that my constituent Bob Levinson went missing off of Kish Island. And as I have said at every hearing that we've had about Iran, that has to continue to be issue one in every discussion that we have with the Iranians. There is a new administration here, and I urge this administration, just as I urged the last administration, to make this a very important priority, and I appreciate your raising the issue. Mr. Albright, you criticized the IAEA for a lack of transparency. I'm very concerned about that as well. My understanding is that the new administration hadn't reached out to the IAEA yet to discuss its monitoring of Iran. Clearly, that's a problem. They need to hear from our representatives to the IAEA. There needs to be an exhaustive discussion with the coordinator for Iran nuclear implementation, whom I understand still holds that position. The administration should do that, but I also, Mr. Chairman, would urge this committee, in order to tackle the issue of transparency, to request that our representatives to the IAEA and the coordinator come to testify here in front of us to address specifically the transparency issues that Mr. Albright has raised. They're very serious. They will impact not just this deal in this year, but as Mr. Albright rightly points out, as the deal carries on for the remainder of its term. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that you will consider that. And finally, Dr. Exum, I want to just spend my remaining couple of minutes talking to you about the strategic flirtation, I think is how you refer to it, that this administration has engaged in with Russia. Before getting specifically to Russia and Iran, that flirtation also takes place as there's a Russian spy ship off of our coast, and as there was a mock attack on a U.S. destroyer in the Black Sea, and at a time when Russia has now deployed a cruise missile, and then focus, with that as background, focus on Iran for a minute. How do we engage in the ways that this administration has seemed intent on doing with Russia, while Iran has thousands of fighters and proxies like Hezbollah fighting alongside the Russians in Iran? And as this committee and this Congress look at additional sanctions outside of the nuclear area, Iran's support for terrorism, for example, how do we do that in an effective way when we're simultaneously engaged in this new relationship with Russia that weakens our ability to do what we need to?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I'll be blunt. I don't think you can do it. I think that, and I'm unfortunately the veteran of many weeks spent across a negotiating table with Russians in Geneva over last year, trying to find some way forward on the conflict in Syria. We conducted these negotiations as Russia was enabling the destruction of East Aleppo and the slaughter of thousands of Syrian civilians. We did so in an effort to determine whether or not Russia might be some sort of partner in Syria, whether they could use their leverage over the regime, over Iran, over Hezbollah, to broker some sort of peace in Syria. And at the conclusion of that, quite bluntly, Mr. Congressman, I don't think that Russia necessarily has the influence over the Syrian regime to be able to broker any type of peace. And I think that, frankly, Russia and the Iranians have more common cause than they do any strategic disagreements. So for me, again, Congressman, I just don't see the administration's outreach towards Russia. I just don't see how they can do that without strengthening the Iranian hand in Syria, without strengthening the Iranian hand regionally, without strengthening the hand of groups like Hezbollah, which pose a clear threat to the state of Israel, and without emboldening groups like Kataib Hezbollah and these Iranian-backed PMF that potentially pose a threat to U.S. forces in Iraq, in addition to the Iraqi state.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Just before I yield back, I would note, for the record, the reason that it's so important to engage immediately in a bipartisan investigation into the relationship between the White House and Russia is not just because of leaks, which seems to be the president's biggest concern, but because of the policy implications that stretch not just not just to U.S., Russia, and our discussions with our NATO allies, but all the way to Iran and the threats against the United States and our allies in the region that Russia may be contributing to. And with that, I yield back.
And thank you, Mr. Deutsch. We now yield to Judge Congressman Ted Poe of Texas.
I thank the chairman. I'm going to talk about Iran, which is, I think, the basis of this hearing. Maybe we'll have a hearing on Russia at some point. I think we gave away the farm, the mineral rights, when we made the Iranian deal. I couldn't disagree with you more, Dr. Exum, about the Iranian deal. It was a bad deal for the United States. We gave them $150 billion that they should not have gotten. I believe that money did not go to build schools and hospitals in Iran. It went to the IRGC, which runs 80% of the economy, and the IRGC funds terrorist operations throughout the world, namely with their proxy group, Hezbollah. So I want to talk about Iran, not Russia, and Iran and their status in the world today. One of you mentioned rules of engagement. Hopefully we'll change the rules of engagement with Iran. I hope that we do, and we don't find ourselves in another situation like in the last administration on January the 10th or 12th of 2016, when two of our river command boats surrendered to the Iranians, so much for the American phrase, don't give up the ship. We gave up 2 ships to the Iranians, and Secretary Kerry almost apologized. We still haven't gotten the facts of that situation. Maybe we'll change the rules of engagement where we don't allow Iranians to capture our ships without a fight over in that part of the world. But I want to talk about the IRGC. Do you think that the IRGC has planned and executed terrorist attacks throughout the world, including against Americans, Mr. Modell?
Thank you for the questions, Congressman. I don't think that there's any doubt whatsoever that the IRGC, particularly the Quds Force, has planned terrorist activities against U.S. and its U.S. forces, U.S. persons, and its allies around the world. I think between 2012 and 2015, there were at least 30 such activities that were in some way traced back to the IRGC. So I don't think that there's any doubt about that whatsoever.
Does the IRGC have training camps in Iran that train other people from other parts of the world in terrorist activities?
I think the publicly available information would point you to Iranian-sponsored and run training camps in southern Lebanon. Are there training camps in Iran? I think that's probably meant for a discussion in a more private setting.
Well, how about in South America? How about South America? Can you answer that question?
South America, beyond the rumors of Iranian training camps in Margarita Island and certain parts of Venezuela, I have not heard of anything. I've heard of Iranian outreach in various nefarious ways to certain groups in Latin America. But the links between, for instance, the Vice President of Venezuela and Iran have been long discussed, and there's been a lot of speculation about links there into terrorism and destabilizing activity.
How about the Iranian sponsor of Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon?
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
That it happens. I mean, they sponsor the terrorist group Hezbollah.
I think it's in a very, not only do they sponsor the terrorist group Hezbollah, but I can tell you that when Syria began in full force and Iran really started to take a leading role, Hezbollah actually put up some resistance and said, we're not sure that we really want to become embroiled in this. And the Iranians strong-armed them and said, yeah, you are going to do that. So it's not a matter of Iran supporting or sponsoring them. It's about them controlling them to a large extent.
Do you think that the IRGC, based on their activities worldwide, their sponsor of terrorism, should be back on the list or on the list as a state or as a sponsor of terrorism? that the Treasury Department should designate them as a terrorist organization? Just wants your opinion.
In my opinion, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that there are certain parts of the IRGC that should be in the Quds Force. I don't think that the original purpose of the designations for foreign terrorist organizations were meant for entire militaries, and that's essentially what the IRGC is. I think it's overreach, and I think it, actually, I don't think it will have much of an impact.
I'm not asking for a foreign terrorist organization designation. I'm asking if you think that the Treasury Department, under their power, should designate it as a terrorist organization. It's a different designation.
Treasury designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization makes sense, just given the depth of IRGC involvement in all facets of Iranian terrorism. So yeah, in that regard, it would be sensible, yes.
I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling this hearing. Now, more than ever, the United States must show the world we're serious about holding Iran to account and enforcing the JCPOA, as well as examining Iran's destabilizing activities around the world. But it is impossible to talk about Iran and not talk about Russia, particularly when you consider Russia's blocking of sanctions against Iran at the UN and Russia's support of Iranian activities in Syria. But I fear that we are at a disadvantage when we have a president who seems unable and unwilling to stand up to Vladimir Putin, Iran's biggest supporter and patron. As the body in the House responsible for our foreign policy, it is incumbent upon us to examine the very real consequences of President Trump's pivot towards Russia and what that means for our national security, our relationships with allies, and the functioning of our own government. Mr. Chairman, it's been 8 months since we had a full committee hearing on Russia. I believe we are long overdue, and we must have witnesses from the administration appear before us and give a full and honest accounting of what their plans are for dealing with this unprecedented Russian aggression and meddling in the United States. Moreover, as the body tasked with oversight of our foreign diplomacy apparatus, we absolutely must require General Michael Flynn to appear before this committee and answer truthfully about what his relationship and contacts were with Russian officials before and during his tenure as National Security Advisor. The issue impacts the United States' relationship with our friends and foes around the world. If we cannot be an honest broker in our dealings with Russia, we lose credibility everywhere. And that's why 19 of my colleagues on this committee and I sent you a letter asking that we have Michael Flynn testify before this committee as soon as possible. I ask unanimous consent that a copy of this letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
This request is made in the context of the following facts. Unprecedented Russian interference in our elections directed by Vladimir Putin to help elect Donald Trump, as concluded by 17 intelligence agencies. A sophisticated plan of hacking, fake news, and a sophisticated use of propaganda. Repeated contacts between the Trump campaign and Russians during the course of the campaign. 3 members of President Trump's inner circle, Carter Page, Paul Manafort, and now Michael Flynn, have to leave the inner circle because of their ties to Russian officials. Secret conversations between the National Security Advisor and the Russian ambassador. Then Michael Flynn lied to the American people, lied to the Vice President of the United States, and denied those conversations happening right on the day that sanctions were imposed for interfering with the American presidential elections. At the same time, Sally Yates, the acting attorney general, brought that information to the attention of the White House counsel, and she concluded that he was a compromised individual who could be blackmailed by the Russians. What did they do? Shortly thereafter, Sally Yates is fired. Michael Flynn stays in place for 17 days with full access to classified information, continuing all of his responsibilities as a national security advisor. This is in the context of a president who is bellicose and fighting with all of our allies, Mexico, Australia, as 2 most recent examples, but has showered praise on the brutal dictator, Vladimir Putin. He maligns our intelligence professionals, compares them to Nazi Germany, and at the same time, we learn that Michael Flynn has appeared at a celebration of RT, the single most powerful Russian propaganda machine, and the president has refused to answer questions about his investments or financial dealings in Russia or to produce his tax returns. Then we learn his son at a real estate conference in 2008 said, and I quote, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets," end quote. And then he went on to say, "We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia." Mr. Chairman, I don't know what else we need to see to fulfill our responsibilities to get to the bottom of this, because we can't have a real conversation about foreign policy or the implications of our relationships with Russia, with Iran, with the rest of the world until we get to the bottom of this. And so while I'm anxious to have a conversation about Iran and anxious to have a conversation about the JCPOA, I am imploring this committee, Republicans and Democrats, to put your country before party, to bring these issues before this committee so we can get to the bottom of this. The American people expect nothing less, and I urge all the members of this committee to join those who have already asked for these hearings because the American people are watching this and they cannot believe that there hasn't been a bipartisan effort in the House of Representatives to get to what has been unprecedented interference in our democratic institutions. The sanctity of our democracy, our ability to defend our very way of life is at stake. And so I don't have a question for this panel. I thank you for your testimony, but I think this gets to the heart of our ability to continue to be a beacon to the world, a place of democracy, of self-government, where foreign governments have no role in helping to pick our leaders or interfering in the policies that we implement in America. And I thank you, and I yield back my remaining 2 seconds.
Mr. Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the issue at hand, but I, as you know, simply can't just let the statements of the past remain on their own without correcting the record. And as long as credibility has been brought up, especially by the other side of the aisle, for my whole life, for literally my entire life, I've watched many of my friends on the other side of the aisle, or that side of the aisle, sidle up to and speak glowingly of horrible dictators like Fidel Castro.
Would the gentleman yield for a minute, just in the interest of comedy, maybe? Let me make this point. Mr. Engel and I have already indicated that the first hearing we're going to do is on this issue after the recess when we come back. So for the members here, what I would just urge is that we have a panel of experts before us. And if we can stay focused on the issue at hand, I think that will allow us, especially with the time and effort and expertise that these 4 individuals have put into studying this problem, allow us to come to some solutions which this committee can then push. In the meantime, we can prepare for the upcoming hearing in 2 weeks in order to deal with the issue, an issue which we've long dealt with on this committee, but I would just urge that the members on both sides of the aisle so that we can get back on topic on something that is quite a challenge. And then in 2 weeks, we will continue with the good work of this committee and hopefully in a bipartisan way. And with that, I'll yield back to General Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence, and I'll bring this back home as quickly as I can. I would just point to, at least most recently, discounting all of my life and watching what I saw. Most recently, regarding Iran and Russia, the Obama administration failed to follow the law and sanction Russia for the sale of the S-300 missile system and various other weapon system, aircraft, armored vehicles, etc. Nary a word, not a word. Russia invades Crimea, nothing, nothing from that side. The faux outrage and concern is what it is, and I would say this as an old soldier.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will not yield. I just want to say this in complimentary fashion. In complimentary fashion, and it doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply to everybody. But in complimentary fashion, welcome to the war. With that, Dr. Exum, thank you for your service to the country. I would also like to refer to the remarks of the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher. While we discuss the marginal errors of the agreement or of Iran's actions, the small infractions, whether it's low-enriched uranium, heavy water stockpiling, ballistic missile activities, the purchase of conventional weapons, etc. I don't think there's any doubt in the room or around the world that in some fashion, 10 or 15 years from now, Iran is going to be a nuclear-armed delivery capability nation. That's who they're going to be. That's what they're going to be. And we're going to deal with that somehow. And I would also say, in agreement with Mr. Rohrbacher, we're not going to go to war with Iran. That's not going to happen. I think the deal's horrible. I always have. It is what it is, and we got to find a way to move forward. I just want to follow up with you, Mr. Modell, with where Mr. Poe is headed, because I was headed there already. What are the ramifications of listing the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization with specific ties to how Treasury treats their transactions and the permutations of the IRGC and those transactions with other countries, other entities? What are the ramifications if that were to happen? You said you didn't think there would be any. It would be marginal. Can you elaborate on that?
Let me elaborate on that. The part that I think would be not marginal at all would be as it would serve as a significant deterrent to foreign businesses who are looking to get into Iran. So the extent that we can declare them as a foreign terrorist organization by Treasury or by State Department, continue to add individuals to the list that exist, Magnitsky list type of sanctions where we're pointing out corruption, and we're actually saying the IRGC's massive commercial enterprise, buyer beware, and so to a large extent, the recovery of Iran's economy, the ability of foreign businesses to go in there and actually conduct transactions would be impacted. So I think there actually, I perhaps misspoke, but I think there would be a significant impact economically when you think about the extent to which the IRGC has control over significant sectors of the Iranian economy, and to the extent to which such a declaration would probably cause a lot more heartburn among companies that are looking to get in. Companies that I speak to right now in a private sector capacity, large oil companies, Europeans, multinationals who are looking, the one thing that they ask, they say, hey, you guys are based in Washington, D.C., we've done a lot of due diligence. We think there's a way we can make a lot of money in Iran. However, there's still this black cloud of sanctions. We don't know where the U.S. is going to go. It's a significant deterrent, even when the lawyers have signed off on it, even when people are, in leading European companies ready to go back in. So those types of things give people real pause. So I would stand corrected and say it would have a significant impact.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you. I would remind all members that House Rule 17 and committee decorum requires us to confine our remarks to the issues under discussion and to avoid discussions of personality. And we now go to Dina Titus of Nevada. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Exum, in your testimony, you talk about the 4P strategy that you followed when you were at the Defense Department under the Obama administration: posture, plans, partners, and preparedness. Well, it seems to me under this administration, our posture has become negative and hostile. Our plans are non-existent. Our partners have all been alienated, and our preparedness is just a state of uncertainty. We've also heard President Trump say, when the Iranians circle our beautiful destroyers with their little boats, they make gestures at our people they shouldn't be allowed to make. They'll be shot out of the water. We heard this confirmed by one of the members of this committee earlier. He was calling for virtual combat on the Gulf Coast. We also heard President Trump tell the leadership of Harley-Davidson nothing is off the table when responding to questions about Iran. Would you just address how this new approach, all this saber rattling, is affecting not only our relationship with Iran, but with the other neighbors and potential partners in that part of the world?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for allowing me to address this question. It's a good one. I think for me, what worries me most about this current administration, and as I said in my opening statement, I think there are individuals within this administration, Secretary Mattis, for example, who come to this administration with deep knowledge of the threat that's posed by Iran, as well as the threat to our own troops and our other various equities within the Middle East. And so I have certain faith in certain individuals in this administration. The two things that worry me, Congresswoman, are first off, sequencing. Strategy is often about prioritization and sequencing. And I see some individuals within this administration really eager to pick a fight with Iran. And I think we need to be very careful about how and when we do that, if we elect to do that. Right now, we still have a lot of hard fighting in Iraq, for example. We've cleared, with our Iraqi partners, to be clear, have cleared eastern part of Mosul. To clear western Mosul is going to take many more months. The middle Euphrates River Valley still has a significant presence of the Islamic State, and we need to remain focused on that at hand. And I sense within this administration that there are some voices who are so eager to confront Iran that they may not have thought through how exactly they sequence it or what prioritization they're putting into place. The second thing, and this is really, I think, the big concern, is just the uncertainty within this administration. I don't think that I'll surprise anybody here on either side of the aisle by saying that the upheavals we've seen within this administration over the past few weeks have been unprecedented, both in terms of personnel, to include the dismissal of the National Security Advisor, to also include some of the ways in which we've alienated some of our key partners, such as I thought it would take some great effort to offend Australia, but we managed to accomplish it in the first 2 weeks of this administration. And they're a key partner. They fought with us in Vietnam. They're active with us off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula in terms of maritime patrols. We depend on these partners to not only defeat Daesh, but also to push back against the threat, the very real threat that my colleagues on this table, as well as the members of this committee, have highlighted in terms of Iran's asymmetric activities. You know, when we interdict weapons shipments off of the coast of Yemen, for example, it's often not U.S. forces who do this. It's often our partner forces that do this. We need those partners. And right now, there's a great deal of uncertainty, I think, among many of them in terms of the strategic direction of this administration, in terms of who can speak for this administration, and it's worrying to me, both as a former official, but also, quite frankly, just as an American citizen testifying before this committee today, ma'am.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Albright?
I'd like to add, I'm not part of the administration in any way, but I don't, and there may be some voices trying to pick a fight with Iran, but I don't think they're trying to pick a fight with Iran. I think they're, even with this idea of putting Iran on notice, I mean, Flynn made clear that they want to have a policy review. They don't have people in place, and they need to do a lot of recruitment. But I think overall, I think they're moving ahead rather deliberately. But Iran does things.
You think we can have it both ways? We can be cozy with Russia and tough on Iran at the same time?
Well, on the Russian issue, Iran is a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Thomas Garrett of Virginia. Mr. Garrett, let's get that microphone closer and make sure you've got the red button on. Thank you.
You do what? Get my 10 seconds back? Just kidding. Anybody who studied the region with any degree of sort of objectivity understands that the IRGC is the fulcrum of power in Iran. The 2009 uprising failed, I believe, in large part due to what Mr. Sherman, my colleague from California, referenced as a willingness of individuals to level firearms at their fellow citizens. And it wasn't obviously just the IRGC, but subsidiary elements such as the Quds forces thereof. And so if we're attempting to ensure better outcomes in Iran, I think we should focus our efforts on the IRGC. I'm not sure if it was Mr. Warbacher or Mr. Perry who initially commented and actually I think it was Mr. Poe who originally commented on potentially extending the Treasury Department's OFAC controls to implement actions wherein they would treat the IRGC as a state sponsor or as a sponsor of terror. But I can't think of a good reason not to do this, except that, as I understand it, the JCPOA instructed a lot of the restrictions, a lot of the sanctions that have been placed on the IRGC to be lifted, which seems to me to be counter to American policy in any number of arenas. Number one, the previous administration's failure to act in 2015 after the Russians waited 5 years to complete the sale of S-300 missiles to Iran created a circumstance wherein, if you understand the capabilities of the S-300 platform, any Generation 4 aircraft carrier-based aircraft really can't take off in the Persian Gulf safely. That's just the reality. And so we have no Gen 5 assets, F-35 comments withheld in that capable range. And truly, I read where we have, quote, a robust suite of plans that are real, resourced, and our forces are ready to execute them, and I wonder if we do, particularly in a world where if we executed a strike with simply F-22s and B-2s, we have about, what, 10 operational platforms of the latter. So if we wanted to act, we couldn't. We know the fulcrum of power in Iran is the IRGC, and we're hamstrung by a JCPOA that doesn't let us attack the fulcrum of power, metaphorically, not literally, the IRGC. And it's hard for me to fathom, having worn a uniform and knowing Ranger Exum, because I use that because it's more impressive than doctor, and Mr. Perry fought alongside and served alongside some of the 500 American service members who we estimate were killed by IEDs manufactured by the IRGC and their subsidiaries, which goes beyond the 283 Americans who died in Beirut, and I could keep going, Lebanon, the Khobar Towers, a plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador here on this soil. So if we want a better outcome in Iran, I would submit that we need to function in a way that we could penalize the IRGC, which will then destabilize the regime, because the guns are what keep the mullahs in power. Having said that, I would ask, and I don't have a ton of time left, if anybody can tell me if, when we do things like send 400 million unmarked euros at a time when it would correlate to the release of foreign-held dual citizens, whether it was ransom or not, the optics are bad, right? If that doesn't encourage the same sort of bad behavior. And I would point to similar activities undertaken not just in the Sudan and North Korea subsequent and precedent to that, but also in Iran. Here are your foreign nationals back. We've got our 400 million. We now have some more people. So I guess, you know, we have what? U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents to the tune of 10, 8 plus 2, I think, held in Iran now. And for us to negotiate in good faith, I would argue, is a betrayal of these folks, of my oath to defend the Constitution and the citizens of the nation that it rules over. And how can we do that? I mean, why not just cut off all activities in any non-military way that we can with the fulcrum of power in Iran, and refuse to do business with those who do business with these folks, and let them choose between economic activities with the United States or with Iran? I think I know which way they make those choices. So I guess this is a really convoluted compound question, but doesn't the JCPOA really hamstring us from attacking metaphorically, not literally, the axis of power, the fulcrum of power in Iran, the IRGC, by virtue of the elements therein, and therefore doesn't it actually serve to perpetuate the existence of the regime? Mr. Modell, sorry, you just get picked at random.
No, Congressman Garrett couldn't agree more. I think that if you're going to actually do the things that Congressman Rohrbacher was talking about, and some of the things that I've mentioned in my testimony, that is weakening the IRGC, you have to focus on that. And I think that the existence of this regime depends on the existence of the IRGC. They're at the center of everything. For them to control 25 to 50% of the economy and not to be held accountable, or for businesses not to be held to a higher standard before doing business with there. And I think, quite frankly, the hurdles are way too low. You're actually contributing to the perpetuation of a regime that is fundamentally against us in every way.
Right. And, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over, but did we not, with the JCPOA, seek to essentially see, hopefully, regime change to a more moderate regime before the Iranians hit that nuclear threshold? That's really the goal, right? Give us time, and if there's a change in the power. But if we don't hit that fulcrum of power, there'll be no regime change, Mr. Albright?
Yeah, well, that was some of the talking points. I'm not sure the negotiators necessarily believe that, but it was, in a sense, they were asked, kick the can down the road, and they did. And we can, on your question on the IRGC, I think the impact on the JCPOA is, do we lose the Europeans or not? I mean, that's really, and so I think the issue for the administration is they're going to have to get out there and manage the relationship with the Europeans. So if they do decide to move forward on listing the IRGC under the executive order as a terrorist organization, that they don't lose the Europeans, because certainly it's their business that'll be affected. But I think it can be done, but it's certainly, the administration has to get out there and talk to them. The Europeans have made it clear that this upsets them. But I think that it can be managed.
Excuse me, if you'd indulge me for just a moment. I think that you're right, that sanctions diplomacy is very important.
I'm afraid time's expired, but we're going to let you put that in writing.
Okay.
Let's see. Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just start by thanking the witnesses for your testimony here today and your service to our country and your work across time on this particularly important issue. Ms. Bauer, I want to emphasize what you talked about in your testimony. I think the 3 points you made are worth repeating. One, the necessity of taking back the narrative, the need to emphasize the sanctions that are still in place, and to enforce those sanctions rigorously, vigorously, to the greatest extent possible. You said in your testimony that sanctions are most effective when they are adapted by the international community, international coalition. My question, I leave this question to the whole panel. What are the challenges to maintaining, if not strengthening, international support for sanctions, and the opportunities to bring increasing bite to the sanctions in place and potential sanctions against Iran's activities, not just around ballistic missiles, but human rights and their activity, conventional weapons throughout the region?
Thank you. I think that one of the challenges to increasing the bite of sanctions and to rebuilding this multilateral coalition that we had before, it does largely come down to the Europeans and the view in Europe that an important part of their dialogue with Iran is a commercial dialogue. But they are divided on this point, and they in fact do maintain sanctions on the IRGC in Europe under their human rights authorities, and they maintain sanctions on Hezbollah's military wing. So there is they are divided on this issue. I think what's important going forward from the U.S. perspective in more vigorously enforcing the sanctions we have is that we continue to do those based on conduct, because that will be continuing to emphasize the ways in which Iran violates international norms will be something that will be helpful in rebuilding a multilateral coalition.
Mr. Albright, you said with the last question that there's a question of do we lose the Europeans? What steps would increase that likelihood? What steps should we be taking to make sure that we don't lose the Europeans in enforcing sanctions?
Yeah, I think and this would reflect just visits in Europe. I mean, this one, they will say, and maybe it's just the optics of it, the additional signal, but they will say that this would end business between the European companies and Iran. I understand what Mrs. Bauer said, and I would actually defer to her. But what I clearly heard was that there's something going on here, that this other designation would cause companies to pull back, and maybe it's not true. Maybe that'll be part of the management is that they should be more careful in the first place based on having these sanctions and the IRGC. But I do think that the administration has to get out there and start discussing these things with them and not just hope for the best.
I'll continue down the panel. Ms. Mardell, you're nodding.
No, I would just second that. I would say that we talk to companies all the time that are on the signed MOUs, and they're on the verge of actually making the leap into Iran, and there still is a real fundamental lack of clarity on their part as to what they can and cannot do. Treasury does a great job of laying out some of the do's and don'ts, and there's U.S. government websites where you can go and see what you can and can't do in the sanctions, but really there's no. It's quite frankly it's cumbersome, and it's a lot to get through. There's no nice easy do's and don'ts list for companies. I think there has to be a media offensive that it reminds companies of the dangers of doing it. And quite frankly, a lot of companies have gone in there and tripped and fallen and had reputational risk. There should be some sort of a list, Consumer Reports, some U.S. government-sponsored website that actually details bad experiences that companies have had in going in there, so that other companies can reach out and say, wait a minute, maybe we ought to think about that. Sounding board, Consumer Reports, if you will. But a lot of companies have experiences that we should be exhibiting.
Dr. Exum, I want to leave you out.
Well, sanctions is not my specialty, and I plead ignorance. I defer to the expertise of the panelists.
Thank you. I have just a little bit of time left, but I think, and I had raised these concerns when the JCPOA was announced, the need to make sure that Iran cannot get any closer to nuclear weapon during the time frame of the JCPOA or any time thereafter, and they need to make it clear that U.S. policy is Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We go to Mr. Ted Lieu of California.
Thank you. Let me first thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for agreeing to have the next hearing be on Russia. I think we all appreciate that. And thank you to the panelists for being here, for your expertise, and thank you, Dr. Exum, for your military service. As you know, Iran is involved in Syria, as is Russia, and there are two news agencies, CNN and Reuters, reporting that the Pentagon is considering sending U.S. conventional ground forces to Syria. That would significantly alter our military footprint and operations in Syria. I think it is a very, very bad idea. The Trump administration has not laid out a plan for what they would do there. They have not set out objectives they would want them to achieve. The Trump administration has not explained who they would support in Syria, nor how long they would be there. I would like to ask each of you, do any of you think it would be a good idea to send our women and men of our military in harm's way into Syria? And let me start with Dr. Exum.
So, Congressman, you're asking all the right questions, if I could be so honest. I think that we'd like to know a lot more about what these soldiers would be doing. I think we'd want to know who they would be. I don't think, I mean, you followed this conflict closely. You know that our overall strategy against the Islamic State has been by, with, and through local partners. So we have had forces on the ground in Iraq and Syria to the degree that they would enable local partners. The strategic dilemma that this administration faces, specifically as it wants to go on Raqqa, is whether or not you can push on Raqqa without arming and training the YPG. Doing so would put at risk our relationship with a NATO ally in Turkey, and I think that's what this administration is wrestling with. We made the decision when we constructed the strategy to counter the Islamic State, which had buy-in from not only the civilians in the Pentagon, but also all the uniforms as well, that working by, with, and through local partners would make more sense. First off, because many of us are Iraq veterans, and we know that the Iraq War cost roughly almost 5,000 U.S. lives. I think during my tenure at the Department of Defense, the way in which we waged the conflict cost the loss of 5 U.S. servicemen. It's also less expensive in terms of monetarily. But more important than that, strategically, the logic is it's more sustainable on the ground. Yeah, it's messier. Yeah, it takes more time. But if local groups have a buy-in to the fight, they have a buy-in to the victory. And that's something that didn't happen after we defeated the insurgency in Iraq in 2007, 2008. To get back to your question, deviating from by, with, and through could potentially, I would caution the administration from deploying the 82nd Airborne on the ground in northeastern Syria. I believe that would be a mistake. I believe it would be costly, not just in terms of money, but in terms of lives. If, by contrast, you're talking about limited conventional forces to help you breach the outer defenses of Raqqa in a way that might mean that you don't have to arm the YPG to the extent that would really inflame the relationship with Turkey. If that's what they're talking about, that's something different. So, Congressman, I think you're asking all the right questions. If I'm in the position of the Pentagon right now, I'm really weighing those options and trying to think about, which forces you're really talking about. So it all depends on kind of the force protection or the forces that they're talking about.
Thank you. So the other balance, you don't have to answer unless you think it's a good idea to send a lot of ground troops into Syria. Do any of you think it's a good idea?
No.
All right. So I have limited time. I want to talk about Yemen. Dr. Exum, you mentioned Yemen. As you know, Iran's involved there. That's right. I don't have a problem with freedom of navigation. What I have a problem with is the United States, we're refueling a Saudi-led coalition of aircraft that drop bombs in Yemen, and we don't have any idea where they drop them. That's been told to us. I've gone to briefings, and we don't know. And it turns out that there has been multiple airstrikes on civilians. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have documented over 70 unlawful airstrikes on wedding parties, on Doctors Without Borders hospital, on schools. Children, women, civilians are being slaughtered. These look like war crimes. And the U.S. military should not be aiding and abetting war crimes. And what I want to know, Dr. Exum, is sort of your view on that issue.
So, Congressman, you put your finger on why I think the last administration was reluctant to get deeper involved in the conflict in Yemen. I think in some ways the last administration, to put it crudely, tried to be half pregnant. There's a strategic argument to be made for if you're going to get involved in the conflict, then help the Saudis and the Emiratis and their coalition win, and help them win in a way that is compliant with the laws of armed conflict and that allows you to have some influence over the way they are involved. Or you completely step away and you say that we can't be involved with this conflict. I think we tried to find a middle ground, and I think that's where that led to some of the confusion and some of the problems. I will say, however, that we do have adversaries in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, for example, the Islamic State in Yemen, where it might make sense to partner with some of our forces on the ground or some of our partners, the Emiratis, for example, who are kind of a cut above the other Gulf forces in terms of their competence. And there it might make sense to partner with them against threats to freedom of navigation. That's something that, like I said, I think it's a U.S. interest. I also think it's a huge interest for the Europeans, for India, for South Korea, for anybody pushing shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb. And so there should be a concerted diplomatic effort to pressure the Iranians with respect to the presence of some anti-ship cruise missiles in Yemen. And if necessary, there should also be a kinetic response, because that's a point where that's always been a key U.S. interest for 50 years in terms of freedom of navigation and commerce around the Arabian Peninsula, and I think you want to take a hard stand there. But I take your points regarding the broader conflict, and I think it was a key topic of debate within the Obama administration, sir.
Well, thank you, thank you. We want to thank again our panel. We appreciate the time of our witnesses today, especially, on this focus of what we do in light of Iran's continued ballistic missile program and its continued transfer of missiles to Hezbollah and the other activities in the region that are threatening to countries in the region. And as Mr. Bauer observed, we should start, I think, with a premise that on these violations, Iran gets no special pass. And we look forward to continuing to work with each of you in terms of the challenges ahead. So thank you, and with that, we stand adjourned. I thought so. Yeah.